Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to the Political Forum. Today is December 1st, 2020. It's been almost a month since the election, and while we are in a very treacherous and turbulent times, sometimes we seek wisdom and prudence from George Washington, our POTUS #1. So to make sense of George Washington's legacy, as well as the wisdom that comes out of his farewell address, I'm honored to introduce you to our two distinguished panelists tonight. So let me introduce you to them first as we get started. So first we have Professor Christopher Brooks, who received his bachelor's and master's in U.S. history from East Stroudsburg University of Pennsylvania. He then received a scholarship to Edinburgh University in Scotland, where he studied British influences on the U.S. judiciary. After 2 years at Edinburgh University, Professor went on to complete his doctoral work at Kassel University in Germany under Professor Horst Dippel. He worked with Professor Dippel on the notion of modern constitutionalism project, which had Professor Brooks editing and translating constitutions from German to English. While in Germany, Professor Brooks was an active member of the Center for North American Research, where he focused on constitutional and legal history, especially as it pertains to jurisprudential matters. He also worked for several mid to large size law firms teaching legal English. Professor Brooks also handled legal translation for many firms and for Germany's highest court, which is pronounced Bundesverfassungsgericht.
Yeah, that's not bad.
Professor Brooks is currently professor of history at East Stroudsburg University, where he teaches transatlantic, legal, constitutional, U.S. and African American history. He also serves as the university-wide pre-law advisor. Professor Brooks writes a monthly column entitled Historically Speaking for the publication of The Morning Call, and he has written a few other newspapers, including in the New York Daily News. Professor Brooks published academic articles and dissertations and co-authored 2 books on German employment law. His current research deals with revisiting the life and times of John S. Rock, the first African-American attorney admitted to argue before the U.S. Supreme Court. Welcome, Professor.
I was muted. Thank you.
Okay, next we have W. West Allen, Esquire. He currently serves as the national president of the Federal Bar Association, the preeminent professional lawyer organization comprised of nearly 20,000 federal judges and practitioners throughout the U.S. They seek to improve our federal legal system and the administration of justice. Mr. Allen is an intellectual property and constitutional law attorney based in Las Vegas, Nevada, and he represents a wide variety of international clients in federal courts. He is a principal with the national law firm of Howard & Howard. Mr. Allen has extensive experience resolving intellectual property disputes concerning patents, trademarks, copyrights, as well as constitutional and federal court claims. Mr. Allen served as chair of the FBA's Government Relations Committee for 7 years and has testified before the U.S. Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Bankruptcy and the courts regarding the effect of sequestration and budget cuts on our federal courts. Mr. Allen co-founded the Nevada State Bar's Intellectual Property Section and was elected to that section's first chair back in 2004. He wrote Nevada's Federal Local Rules of Practice for patent cases and has served 5 times on the federal court's magistrate judge merit selection and reappointment panels. He also served as the panel's chair in that capacity. Currently, Mr. Allen serves on the Nevada District Court Review Commission to assist Nevada's U.S. senators in selecting candidates to serve as federal district judges. Within his community, Mr. Allen has taught intellectual property law at the UNLV, and he serves on the board of directors for Nevada's favorite charity called Opportunity Village that assists citizens with intellectual disabilities. He also volunteers as a pro bono attorney for the Children's Attorneys Project with the Legal Aid Center of Southern Nevada. Welcome. Okay, so what we'll do is I will turn it over to Wes, and he's going to give us an overview of today's topic, and then after that, I will turn it over to Professor. So, Mr. Allen, welcome.
Well, thanks everyone. Thomas, especially for the invitation. I'm pleasure to be here, especially with Professor Brooks, who my son lived for a while in Germany, so I'm looking forward to hearing some of his German accent. I'm honored to talk to it's a small group, but it's an engaged group of citizens there in New York. I have dear friends in New York City. Some I thought were going to call in, but mostly I'm pleased to discuss with you and those who are interested a little bit about the Constitution of the United States, and in particular, the farewell address of George Washington. Now, my remarks tonight stem and flow a little bit from a speech I gave at my presidential installation that was on Constitution Day here on September 17th in Las Vegas just a couple months ago. And in that discussion, I raised and premised the idea that all citizens have a constitutional oath, if you will, a citizenship, a covenant of citizenship that is the very means by which our republic functions. In particular, lawyers and judges go into the courtroom and we regularly take upon us oaths. We take upon us an oath to be truthful. We take upon us an oath to defend and honor and respect the Constitution, to administrate the Constitution in the way that it was intended. We do this as lawyers, as judges, but really we do it as citizens. As citizens of a republic, we truly have an obligation, I believe, to be educated, to be informed, to consciously elevate our mind as far as understanding of how government works and what makes a republic work. And to that end, the Constitution was implemented among the newfound freedom of citizens of the United States as really a whole new endeavor. As had been noted before, most ideas of independence came from power, where a king would say, okay, you can go have a little bit of autonomy out there in Jamestown or out there wherever I might send you. But after the independence was won, it was suddenly the power of the people to decide what their life would be, what their government would be. And of course, as we know, the first effort was the Articles of Confederation, and they just weren't strong enough. We didn't really have a federal system. And so we met again, and our representatives put together what became what many call the Miracle of Philadelphia, which was the Constitution of the United States. And for me, when I examine the Constitution of the United States and also juxtapose that to George Washington's farewell address, I find a lot of principles that are applicable today and necessary today. So I thought I'd just briefly begin with a quick introduction of what I consider the 5 fundamental principles of the Constitution, and then go over real quickly the kind of an outline of George Washington's farewell address, which I believe teaches us some ideas and concepts that are just critical for our moment right now. Right before the talk or the phone call began, I heard Professor Brooks indicate a desire to maybe speak of a little bit the principle of unity, which permeates George Washington's farewell address. And I hope we get a chance to talk about that. But first, for me, I think it's important as a groundwork for what we'll discuss today to understand what I think of at least 5 fundamental principles of the Constitution. And I want to understand those because I think these are the building blocks of government that George Washington understood and that he encouraged us most earnestly to maintain in the Constitution. And so first I'll talk about those. And I just wanted to note the main one is the first one of popular sovereignty. The idea that the people are the only source of government power, that government is chartered by limited enumerated powers that are to be exercised only as the people authorize it and according to the written law, which for us is the Constitution. The second idea is that of federalism. The division of power between state and federal governments exists, and it exists to diffuse federalized power, to distribute the natural accumulation of power in one place, which our founders understood all too well from the previous 2,000 years of government. Third is the idea of separation of powers, the idea that the people's government has three coordinate and equal branches of government that are held, that further diffuse the power of government, and that each has checks and balances on the others. Fourth is the idea that we have in our first four amendments of the Constitution, which is the principles of the Bill of Rights, that there are certain rights that are enumerated, in particular, first 10 amendments to the Constitution, but they are to be held inviolable by government. And that these include the freedom of religion, the freedom of speech, the freedom of the press, the freedom to peacefully assemble, and the right to petition government for grievances. And that no action by government should ever subvert these rights. And then fifth is the premise and the idea of the rule of law itself, that all citizens are governed by and held accountable to laws that are just, publicly promulgated, equally enforced, and independently adjudicated, because vague, incoherent, or arbitrary or unwritten law is no law at all. And so with those five fundamental principles, I mentioned in my speech the idea that we as citizens have the obligation to understand that framework and that foundation of the Constitution and to build the superstructure of government upon it. We don't need to tear it down. We don't need to think there's a better way. It's truly a remarkable system that if we understand it, we can do as Washington suggested. In fact, there in New York, you have one of my favorite parks there, Washington Square Park. And I know all of you've been there and look up and seen that arch and read those words where it says, "Let us raise a standard to which the wise and honest can repair. The event is in the hand of God." And I hear that, and it's definitely worth remembering, because the idea that our first founder, our principal founder, George Washington, our first president, the idea that he understood that the principles of the Constitution form a base, the cornerstones upon which we build government. And he didn't just view the Constitution as the system of government that would bless and help Americans. He viewed it as a system of government that would benefit the freedom of the whole world, and that this nation would become a beacon or a light to the world that, if we maintained it properly, would promote freedom and rights of all humankind throughout the world. And I think that was the vision that Washington had. And so with that idea in mind, he encouraged everyone to rise up and be well educated and to understand the principles of government and to defend them to the very end, to never abandon them, and to maintain those principles. And so I found it most intriguing, and I mentioned in my discussion that one of the things that we can do today to understand and honor the constitutional principles, those five I laid out, and among, I should say, in addition to those five, if one studies the Constitution carefully, and even George Washington's farewell address, I believe there are what I call the unspoken principles of the Constitution that are pervasive, that teach us the same types of lessons and characteristics we need today. Things such as unity, mutual respect, kindness, valor, virtue. You can go on and on. There are multiple principles that are set forth in the Constitution, and you can glean from the farewell address of George Washington. So after the Constitution was implemented, we elected George Washington to be our first president. George Washington did two remarkable things in my mind, among many. And that was at the end of his term, his second term, or around 1796, as everyone presumed, of course, he would just keep going. Washington had the wisdom to do a remarkable thing, as we all know from your Hamilton play out there now, something that King George didn't know was a thing a person could do, which is to step away from power and to let truly the people administer their affairs, and not have a king or a despot or even someone who over time kind of became a defunct king, but someone who would have the wisdom to understand that the people are in charge and I'm not going to reign over them for some extended period of time. And so he sat down, and with the prior help of James Madison, when I think he may have even stepped down after the first term had it not been so important that he keep going. But he sat down and with the help of James Madison and Alexander Hamilton, he put together what we now call the farewell address. And he basically sent it off to our nation to be words of wisdom, as he called it, from a good old friend. And he did it in a way that is most profound. And I think if you study it out carefully, you can find an elegance to the speech that isn't normally appreciated, partly because the words are not how we speak today. But for me, when I break down the speech of George Washington, I think of it as in two parts. The first part has its express purpose, which is to tell everyone, I'm not going to be considered as president of the United States for a third term. So right up front, he tells everybody the importance of what he's going to talk about, which is number one, I'm stepping down. And then he gives a brief report of what he did. And then at the end of that first section, he literally gives what I just think of as a blessing. He literally invokes the power of a blessing to the citizens of the United States and to the nation. He literally says that he's essentially covenanting or praying that the Constitution will be maintained and administered with wisdom and virtue, which is the essence of liberty and happiness. And it's just a remarkable paragraph right there in the front of the farewell address. And then from there, the bulk of the Constitution or the farewell address is what I think of as part two, which is the large section of counsel. He gives long dissertation on all things he thinks we should know to maintain that government with wisdom and virtue. And then he goes through, after talking about unity, which is a big point, he talks about things to be aware of and things not to do. And then he gives us a list of things to do. So again, it's remarkable in its elegance, and we map it out what he says in that speech. And then finally, the second part of part two, which is I think of as the closing, and that's where he again notes the purpose of his address. He declares America's neutrality essentially in that time, which is right around beginning of 1800. We were very new, and he wanted to maintain neutrality from Europe and picking sides because he knew if we pick sides, he could wipe us out. And he knew we weren't ready for that. So he expressed our neutrality to the dispute in Europe. And then he gave his farewell. And so that for me is the outline of the address of George Washington. And as you go through those different parts, the part one purpose report and the blessing he gave us. And then the part two, the large extended discussion on his counsel, which I would think of, and he literally called it the secret to national happiness. Those things are the very things that I think, as Professor Brooks might talk about, that are desperately needed in our nation today. I personally believe, and I mentioned this in my discussion, that our nation is at a critical point, just like it was at the time of the Revolution, just like it was at the time of the Civil War, and even to a greater extent. I grew up in the South. I was a part and saw growing up the Civil Rights Movement. And I can say our moment right now today in history is really critical because it's almost as though the Constitution itself is at stake. We have political leaders who routinely don't understand the Constitution, or even worse, routinely say something's unconstitutional when they use that phrase as a bumper sticker and they don't know what it means, which can be dangerous. We have people who try to wrap themselves in the Constitution for political purposes. All of that is deleterious to our republic. And Washington warned against all of it. And so I thought maybe in closing my introductory remarks, I just wanted to mention a couple of things that are in that counsel section of what George Washington talked about that we could read and reread and understand, and hope our wise leaders will understand just continually, and it would be to our benefit. And alas, it's going to come up to citizens like you and I and Professor and your friends to understand these things, to read them, to learn them, to let them sink in, with some soberness to apply them. But let me just mention a couple of quick things that are significant to me. I want to mention that part I said there was kind of what I call a blessing, which is in that first part of the words of Washington. He literally said this. He said he was going to, with unceasing vows and kind of praying to heaven, if you will, he says that he hopes that heaven will continue to you, talking to all of us as Americans, the choicest tokens of Almighty's beneficence, and that your union and brotherly affection may be perpetual. Consider that for a minute. Our union and affection for one another will be perpetual, and that our free Constitution, which is the work of our hands, may be sacredly maintained, that its administration in every department may be stamped with wisdom and virtue. That's just beautiful. I mean, the idea that the Constitution is entrusted to us, that our founder is going to be praying to his God, that we understand it and that we maintain it with wisdom and virtue. And so with that kind of introductory blessing, he goes into the long discussion of counsel. And I almost wish we could spend an hour just walking through all the things he said, go do and don't do, but I'll mention some of them. Because for me, one of the things that he gave in the counsel section is this profound formula for happiness. He basically said, hearken to the things I'm going to tell you. And if you do these things, you will have national happiness. And there's one thing that seems like our world needs today is the United States to have national happiness and harmony. Because right now, if we would look at what the Constitution says, and especially look at where George Washington left us as his legacy when he was departing, I think we have a lot we can learn from him. But I'll mention this idea that unity, it's almost a formula. He explained that unity leads to liberty and liberty leads to happiness. So let me say that again. Unity, the importance of unity is that it's the foundation and pillar of liberty. And it's what liberty that leads to national happiness. And I'm not making that up. I'm just following verbatim kind of what Washington laid out. And so he begins his counsel by explaining the importance of unity. And we could spend all night just talking about that principle, because Washington was very anxious that the system of government was fragile and the Constitution wouldn't make it. He was literally worried that the factions between the North, the South, and to some extent the West would break us down into factions, and even worse, as we'll talk about at the end of his counsel, parties. He recognized that it's bad to break yourselves up by geographical location. Today, we might think of that as suburbs or urban life and rural life. And he also said it's dangerous to break yourself down by parties. And the reason of that is simple. A house divided against itself will fall. And he understood that we're Americans first. And so he pointed out the things that unify us, namely the Constitution, the fight we had with blood and sacrifice to have freedom. And he lays it out pretty clearly. And he talks about you are one country, it's our country, and you should be a family. And then he explains that unity leads to liberty. And it's that liberty that leads to happiness. And so he says over and over again to have unity, to work together, because you're working together is what gives liberty, makes liberty possible, and ultimately makes your union have happiness. The essence of what Washington said for me is that he laid out the secret to national happiness. And he explained how unity is the pillar of that, and how if you're unified, you can practice and have liberty. And then he also goes through all the things that kind of lead to that unity. And one of them, which is for me, the big focus is what I started with, which is the Constitution. He talked about how if you honor the Constitution, it leads to unity. So now the formula is understand and honor the Constitution. That leads to a oneness, a unity, because you're Americans, you're one nation, and you're together working for this idea of liberty. So honoring the Constitution leads to unity, unity leads to liberty, liberty leads to happiness. Let me just end with a couple of the points that he said of things to beware of, because after he explained that formula, he went through many pages to talk about things that wise people should be watching for, because it's going to happen and it's dangerous. And among these are any people who are seeking to self-aggrandize themselves or seeking to self-aggrandize their party at what might, and they might even wrap themselves in the Constitution to do it. And I think that's significantly important today, because we have political parties who routinely want to say, me and the Constitution are over here, and you and your people and your party are over there. And that is exactly what Washington did not want us ever to do. So in my mind, if you see anyone practicing that, they don't understand the Constitution and they don't understand the words of wisdom of George Washington. But if they are careful to monitor against that, I think George Washington was telling us in his farewell address, for the next 200, 300, 400 years, watch for these things. And if you see them, work assiduously to do away with them. So we're not supposed to have those that kind of seek self-aggrandizement. We're not supposed to have those who are trying to build up their own faction at at the disunity of others. So if you see a group of people trying to say it's all us against all them, George Washington said, don't do that. He said, be one family. To that end, I noted how George Washington said that essentially beware of factions that seek to to not enforce law, but to avoid even for what may be popular ends in an effort to subvert the power of the people by cunning to gain personal power for themselves. That's the essence of what he said when he started talking about unity. He literally pointed out how we need to be mindful that some people, even for what appear to be popular reasons, are going to try to subvert the law and the Constitution. So we see that today all the time. We see people who say, let's not deal or have the Constitution because it's a good popular thing. Well, Washington said, be very careful about that, because what may seem popular now, that same principle of not applying the Constitution or rejecting the Constitution can come back to give you unhappiness later. He gave some stark warnings about, we'll talk about it maybe more detail, but as we already noted, he gave a real stark warning and a whole section about the baneful effects of the spirit of party generally. And that's the same idea. You can't be unified when you're so beholden to a particular political party that you view the other side as your enemy. And never has that been more applicable than right now. And yet we ignore the wisdom of George Washington when we become so beholden to a party that it engenders enmity or feelings that are unkind to another group of citizens. We need to be aware against that. And it's interesting that some of these things that you talk about almost sound like what your grandma and grandpa would have told you, but they're right there with George Washington, not as he's not trying to necessarily be a moral leader. He's just saying for political and happiness in your nation, these things are what will lead to that happiness. In fact, after talking about the baneful effects of party system, he goes out of his way to almost become spiritual, because he goes out of his way to say that you need to know and understand the power and the importance of religion and morality. Because for Washington, a republic will not stand unless it has public morality. And public morality, he was very clear, is only possible by religion. And so whether you believe in God or whether you believe in religion, if you believe in republics and freedom, you better understand that the idea of a religion which promotes morality is the very essence of a successful republic. And so I've long been a big advocate of the First Amendment and the freedom of exercise of religion, because regardless of my personal position on religion, I recognize, as George Washington did, if you want a republic to be strong and powerful, it has to be self-regulating. And a people that are self-regulating understand morality, and they get morality from religion. In fact, George Washington goes out of his way to say that is the only way they're going to get it, at least to the extent it's necessary to run an effective republic. And so I always thought it was interesting. The first time I read seriously the farewell address of George Washington, I was profoundly impacted by the importance that he placed on religion and morality for a successful republic. And I don't know that we think about that anymore. We have a tendency to be very secular today, which is just a fact, perhaps. But I know George Washington didn't view it as just a phenomenon. He viewed it as a danger to the republic if we start to have a people who reject the idea of morality. And in particular, they don't have it because no one's practicing a religion. So I note that that's something that may seem incongruous to our popular world today, but it was definitely something that was important to George Washington. And then I'll mention a couple of last things. He said the same types of things that wise leaders would say today. He talked about the importance of cherishing public credit, to not have too many debts, to have revenue that meets your debts. He talked about cultivating peace with all people. He warned against the unnecessary entanglement and permanent alliances with other nations, especially those that would tend to require or would tend to give rise to other nations thinking that you owed them a favor, or that you were ungracious and expressed ingratitude because you didn't do something for them later. He was very clear about not just unity, not just religion and morality, but about avoiding undue entanglements with foreign enterprises. And then he warned very sternly against what he viewed as what always happens in a republic is you get foreign outside parties trying to jeopardize and influence the republic. And I think for Washington, he recognized the dangers that there will always be outside influences trying to bring down a republic, maybe because he understood how powerful and strong it would be among nations. But then ultimately, he recognized that the real danger to a republic, while you have to be vigilant against outside interventions, the real danger to the republic is from within. Because if we aren't doing the things that keep us unified and help us with our sense of essentially right and wrong, so you don't have to have laws that dictate everything. If we can't do that, we're going to be in trouble. And so he kind of closed up his counsel with the idea, again, beware of parties, beware of baneful influence of parties, beware of foreign influences, talking about the importance of morality, talking about not being intertangled with foreign alliances, whether for good or for bad, or for whether it's your enemies or people you perpetually love. He said, basically, be careful. Don't necessarily hate someone all the time just because it's tradition, or vice versa. Don't necessarily just be beholden to one foreign nation because it's tradition. And then with that, he did what I call part 3, which is essentially the closing and the farewell. And I'll just close with his closing. He offered what I think is just beautiful language. He said, I'm offering to you, my countrymen, these counsels of an old and affectionate friend. I dare not hope they will make the strong and lasting impression I could wish. In other words, he's saying, I'm just going to be your friend here, like your dear loving parent. And I know you may not listen to all this, but I hope you will. And then he goes on again to explain, I'm doing it because I want you to avoid the fury of party spirit. I want you to warn yourself against the mischiefs of foreign intrigue. And I want you to guard against the impostures of pretended patriotism, which is, again, that idea of people looking out for themselves or their party, as opposed to looking out for the nation collectively. And then he expresses his neutrality. Again, in 1800s, we had to be neutral, so we weren't fighting and suggesting a war come upon us before we were ready. And then he leaves us with that last farewell, those last 2 paragraphs of his speech, which, if you read carefully, for me, is just fraught with principles and concepts, really virtues that every nation and every person should possess. If you read those last 2 paragraphs carefully, you'll see ideas of these types of virtues that were expressed and manifest in Washington's life himself. The idea of humility. I love how he says that I'm too sensible of my own defects to think it probable that I may have not committed errors. In other words, he recognizes, yes, he messed up because he's just a man. But then he hopes that people will forgive him. So he has humility. He talks about hope. He talks about forgiveness. He talks about service, about the work of maintaining the Constitution. He hopes that he's going to rest one day. He talks about love and patriotism for himself or for the nation, for his posterity, the importance of citizenship, of the law, of the Constitution, and ultimately his hope that he can rest from his labors. And with that, he ends his farewell address to us all. So I hope that we can and we should study the farewell address of Washington. It's more applicable now than perhaps at any time since the Civil War. And in fact, I often think, what would it be like if literally we could speak to our founders somehow still today? And I don't know that they would say anything more than what they've written. And I don't know in particular if George Washington would tell us anything other than say, you know what, I wrote that down for you. And if you will study it, you will know the way of happiness. If you don't, your republic will be imperiled. And I think that's what he would tell us. So with that, I'll close. I probably went too long, but I just love talking about the farewell address. And I hope everyone has a chance to study it frequently and encourage your political leaders to study it frequently. So thanks, everybody. Thanks, Thomas.
Okay, thank you for those introductory remarks. Now let's turn it over to Professor Brooks.
Oh, thank you. And thank you, Mr. Allen, for the very thorough coverage of the address. Thank you for that. I just wanted to say something that popped into my mind as Mr. West was giving his opening remarks. And made me think about George Washington's character and the importance of character in particular in leadership positions. And one thing that I think is sort of like a quintessential George Washington moment was when there was discussion on how to address the President of the United States. So some of his admirers and followers, officers who had been under his command in the revolution and so on, they thought they should address him as Your Honor, Your Highness, or even Your Majesty. And Washington replies to this discussion, Mr. President will do. That's all he said. And I think that says a lot about George Washington's character and the high bar that he set for every president to follow. So, when we today think about presidents, I'm not that excited. It seems that this bar that was set with the first one is so high with respect to character, morality. The man wasn't perfect, as Mr. Allen also pointed out. I mean, he was very cognizant of the fact that he was a failed man. But just a remarkable human being. In any event, I wanted to touch on a little bit about the address, not too much because most of it was covered. And then I want to finish off with a story, something that actually happened only a few days ago to me, that I think speaks to this issue of unity, or really lack thereof, in our nation today. So the one part, and I'm going to keep my remarks pretty short so people can ask questions and whatnot, but the one part of the address that really jumped out at me, always has, and was prompted me to write, and I ended up quoting it over and over, is this idea of the baneful effect of faction, or impact of faction. In this one section where, and I'm just going to read it. All obstructions to the execution of the laws, all combinations and associations, under whatever plausible character, with the real design to direct, control, counteract, or awe the regular deliberation and action of the constituted authorities, are destructive of this fundamental principle and a fatal tendency. They serve to organize faction, to give an artificial and extraordinary force, to put in place the will of a party, often a small but artful and enterprising minority of the community, and according to the alternate triumphs of different parties, to make the public administration the mirror of the ill-concerted and incongruous projects of faction, rather than the organ of consistent and wholesome plans, digested by common councils and modified by mutual interests. In 21st century, parties are dangerous. And I guess the thing I want to sort of segue into here is, again, these two kind of odd phone calls I had. One was with a friend of mine, somebody I've been friends with for 30 plus years. And this person was commenting that, about George Washington, or excuse me, about the current president, Trump's rhetoric was uniting in nature. And I was trying to ascertain why, and I guess I got loud, started talking over my friend and so on and so forth, and it created an awkward situation. About half an hour later, speaking with another, actually a mentor of mine, and his wife, it was on speakerphone. on speaker. The phone was, and I was explaining or conveying the conversation I just had to say, hey, this is about where the country is. And my mentor's wife got so upset that I was just in the mere conveying of, well, Mr. Trump's rhetoric is uniting in nature. She hung up the phone. And I just, the fact that we are there as a nation, this is just a very small day-to-day example of what I think a lot of Americans are experiencing. Sort of dinner table politics. And I really think that it's actually what prompted me to write the article I wrote back in September, and actually the one I wrote last month, that as much as we may disagree with one another, we have to look past that. And I think that's really sort of the underlying message of the farewell address too, that it's our duty as citizens of this country to look past that, as difficult as that may be, as difficult as it is to look through, if not past, the rhetoric of the 24-hour news cycle. And that's a challenge, because we are humans, we are fallible, we are emotional. And I think trying to control those emotions and trying to be rational human beings is also something that other founders like James Wilson, Thomas Jefferson, and others spoke to this issue. It's not easy sometimes. As we know, Hamilton died in a duel. So, I mean, how rational was that? So, anyway, I could go on for days, in particular about presidential elections and basically how we've gotten to where we are today. But I would rather take questions rather than lecture, but I'm going to leave that to Thomas.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Professor Brooks, for your introductory remarks. What we'll do is I will ask some follow-up questions to both of our panelists based on their overview, and then you as an audience, if you do have questions that you want to direct at either one of the panelists, please use the function on the app. You could just raise your hand digitally by using that blue function. If you don't know how to use it, just send me a message and I'll try to walk you through. So sticking with history, Professor Brooks, let's just take a step back. And this literature that we're calling the farewell address, it's essentially like an open letter, isn't it, to the nation?
Yeah, he actually published it in a newspaper. He didn't actually deliver it. Not like what has happened ultimately since the Civil War, or 1862, continuously since 1888, in the U.S. Senate. It was also that was common for the times. The State of the Union address being printed in the newspaper. People read papers. That's how things were communicated, and then people would speak amongst themselves in their immediate communities. There was an attention to what was happening in New York or Philadelphia, the early capitals, and eventually Washington by 1800. But there was a lot more attention to local leaders in local politics. And some would say that that all changed once we could directly elect senators, but that's a discussion for another time.
Yeah. And some people forget that George Washington did not belong to any political party. He was not a Republican, not a Democrat, nor a Federalist for that matter. What's the significance of his non-party alliance?
The significance of it, I think a lot of it may stem from his military background and his desire to serve without being pigeonholed as being, well, a member of the Whig Party, which would have been the case, or the country or court party, parties which are the early parties that we kind of adopted, the colonists adopted at the very end of the 17th century into the early 18th century. But I think, the significance, well, again, we can go back to his character and his desire to try to unify people by speaking to what was sort of a common sense. And I think Mr. Allen addressed it, that common denominator for his time, and even in some places still in the United States, was religion. God was a unifying factor. It is no longer, or he is no longer, but, well, again, it depends on whom you ask. But that was a common denominator. And I think that I'm going to kind of, again, bridge the gap from history to more current times, if that's okay, in answering this question. But we have focused heavily on our differences and not enough on our similarities. So even if we work within a secular society and remove God or from the public square, or limit God's impact in the public square, okay, let's just say that that is the expected norm. If one does that and focuses on, quote, celebrating difference, end quote, rather than talking about what brings us together, we're doomed.
And the fact that he stepped down after 2 terms, again, how significant do you think that is for the future presidents to come?
I think it's huge, to put it bluntly. He could have served, well, he ended up passing away in 1799. He could have very easily served until he passed away. He was reluctant to take the job. He was called to duty, and he made it clear in multiple letters that, in even inaugural addresses. In fact, he has the shortest inaugural address amongst all presidents. Well, I think it was his first one or second one, 150 words. That's short, folks. That's about 3/4 of a page. It's pretty impressive. He was not interested, I don't think, for personal reasons, in serving much longer, from having been away from home for so many, years of his life, serving in the military, not only during the American Revolution, but also during the French Indian War. So I think Washington basically wanted to go home and stay there. That was part of it. But it was more than that. It wasn't just that simple practical side. It was also, I think he saw a danger in somebody serving more than 2 terms, because that could lead to the kinds of problems that the folks in the founding era witnessed, or in Britain, or really on the continent of Europe.
And speaking of his military background, it was very easy for America at the time to get drawn into another overseas conflict, most notably the French Revolution. How much do you think Washington's background in the military allowed him to be more disciplined about not engaging in foreign interventions?
I think that his experiences in the military really educated his opinion on this. Your question makes me think of letters to people like William Duer. William Duer was the first Assistant Secretary of State, and also responsible for the first stock market crash in American history in 1792. You can Google him, he's fun. But um, about Washington writing and asking for supplies for soldiers, for asking for shoes for soldiers in this time of year, with snow actually on the ground, and saying, well, what's the problem? Well, one state doesn't want to help another state. This is also, these events actually are one can very strongly argue. These are the events that really led to Washington being such a strong proponent of having a stronger central government than the Articles of Confederation allowed.
Okay. Question for Mr. Allen. I know you mentioned one of the pillars of the principles that Washington set forth, one being protecting the Bill of Rights. However, there's a passage in the farewell address where he says the basis of our political system is the right of the people to make and alter their constitution. So the founding fathers also saw the need that one day they might have to make certain amendments or pass laws to satisfy the needs of the time. So in that regard, perhaps the Bill of Rights is not all-inclusive set of rights that the state could offer to its citizenry, don't you think?
Yeah, this is a professor question, really, because the history shows that one of the reasons we didn't have a Bill of Rights right away was because there was great concern that if you tried to enumerate things that are inalienable, you were necessarily precluding what else might be out there that are unalienable rights that weren't given by government. So I think that's accurate, that Washington understood there are certain things that belong invariably to people themselves because of their human nature. And the Bill of Rights was set forth to, at a minimum, protect those very basic things, beginning with, ironically or prodigiously, the freedom of religion. There's a lot of talk about why that's called the first freedom and why it's the first place in the First Amendment. And I think a lot of that is because many of the founding generation, obviously George Washington, understood the deep, profound nature, much more than just what we think of it today, but the real kind of pillar of a republic that religion and morality are. And I think that's one of the things that tends to be lost, again, whether you believe in God or have a faith or a religion or you do not. I'm setting that aside. The important point from a political standpoint is that to make a republic work well, you want your citizens to be men and women of faith and of religion so that they have morality. And, again, it's almost empirical, even though it's a religious topic, but it's empirical that if your citizens don't understand religion, I mean, take China, for example, you have, over 1 billion people who are good people, but without any understanding of religion, it may be hard to really be governed by morality, or at least have your government think you can be governed by morality. And so government becomes all inclusive because government kind of views people as a little bit docile that have to be controlled with laws because otherwise people are unruly. In the United States, we don't believe that. In the United States, we believe that we can be self-ruling and have the ability to govern ourselves. And so I think that was unique for the world in 1787 and when the Bill of Rights were thereafter passed. And it remains kind of ethereal today. It's elusive. People don't really seem to get that or understand it. Again, if you may not be part of any religion, but at least understand from a political standpoint that the United States and a republic work best when you have people that are exercising their religion. I think Alice de Tocqueville, the French erudite that came over and tried to understand what the United States really did right, what made democracy work in the United States as opposed to other places in the world, and the difficulty, if you will, that France had when it had its fight for independence. It was a different type of a revolution. It wasn't a religious one at all. In fact, it was marred by murder and mayhem and some very unseemly things. In the United States, we had a system that was set up with people that were, historically just were very religious. and that had some benefits for self-governance.
So you had mentioned about this notion of public morality, and I think some of the examples that were either cited or kind of referenced were things like valor, virtue, kindness. But then if you look at the life of George Washington, I don't think he was particularly like a devout Christian, or he wasn't a member of any particular congregation. In fact, most of the founding fathers and the framers were, I think, non-deist. And I believe Washington was more of like a Stoic tradition coming from the ancient Greek cultures. I believe he was a student of Stoicism, like Seneca and others. So isn't it more based on those kind of philosophical, like the Western philosophy, as opposed to, let's say, Judeo-Christian values?
Yeah, I'll say this. I note that in today's world, we tend to think of religion as churches, a particular type of church, whether it's Christian church, any religion you pick. And in the days of the founding generation, it doesn't take a brilliant student of history to realize that different sects of religion were not good examples of what we should have as far as a church, one might say. I say that because those founding generations, they saw the dangers of, for example, the Church of England, where you had to be part of the Church of England, and if you weren't, you were punished. If you didn't go to church, you were punished, and they recognized that that's not good, and so they definitely distanced themselves from any particular church. But they were profoundly religious. There's no question about that. They had a sense of an Almighty that permeated everything they said and did. There's no question about that. And I think that's good to understand, because regardless of one's religion, even if one believes in God or does not believe in God, I think one should recognize the wisdom of those characteristics, like humility, like in the farewell address, where Washington was expressing the ideas of forgiveness. Like, I haven't been perfect and I made a lot of mistakes. I'm the first to say I'm not very good even at what I did, but I tried my best and I hope you'll forgive me. In fact, I love the way he said it. I think it's at the end of the Hamilton play. But the way he says, he hopes that we'll consign essentially to oblivion his mistakes and not bring them up, which is ironic because, a lot of things we hear today are, oh, these people were terrible. They had slaves, or they did this, or they did that. And we don't understand that perhaps in context. And as a result, we might miss the wisdom that they did convey. And even the humility they had to say, no, we're not perfect and I wasn't perfect, but I hope you'll forget my weaknesses and listen to the wisdom I'm trying to pass on. And I think that's what's so brilliant about the farewell address.
And speaking of the importance of the Bill of Rights, sometimes I think you also had mentioned about how our Constitution is at stake. But if you talk to people on different ideological strides, whether it be on the left or the right, they tend to pick and choose certain amendments they like, but then kind of downplay other amendments that maybe are not relevant. So, like, for instance, a lot of conservatives will certainly invoke the Second Amendment as well as the 10th Amendment, that being, the right to bear arms and the states' rights, and to some extent, certain parts of the First Amendment in terms of the free exercise of religion. Those on the left tend to focus more on things like due process and the Fifth Amendment, the Sixth Amendment, and then the Eighth Amendment in the name of criminal justice reform. Again, that's the right to have a speedy trial. So speaking of, kind of having some kind of unity, what would you say to those who selectively interpret the Bill of Rights to kind of fit their own personal ideological views and not apply them kind of universally? Because it seems like the principle here is that all these things are so core and foundational to our republic. We need to adopt just about every, virtues that come out of it. But it seems like we're only picking and choosing certain things to fit our partisan perspectives. What would you say about that?
Is that for me or Professor?
Yes, both of you. Please.
I wasn't sure who you were asking. Wow. Well, I'm not really sure where to begin. I want to actually, I'm still stuck on this idea of religion and something that Mr. West mentioned without using the word, this anachronistic view or lens through which our current society is looking at people from the founding era, or even people from the 1970s for that matter. Looking at things contextually is extremely difficult. And because it forces a person to, and I know I'm not really answering the question posed, but I think this is a very important point. This goes back to the challenge or the gauntlet put before us in trying to have a unified republic and setting aside emotions. And I think that what is happening now is when people look at history without actually reading history. Maybe some people will read a lot and still have a jaded view, and that happens. But most who do read it, and when I say read it, I'm talking about history that was written not only in our day, but perhaps history that was written at the beginning of the 20th century, or even in the 19th century, with the different perspectives. For example, people had on Christopher Columbus, or in sort of here, the question at hand, George Washington. I think that the anachronism is extremely dangerous and really pernicious, and it does close the door to allowing us today in the 21st century to really acknowledge the brilliance and learn from it. That doesn't mean that we have to follow exactly what people did in the 18th century. Of course not. I mean, in most cases, that'd be rather absurd. I certainly wouldn't be talking to you right now as a brown-skinned American, or be in the role that I am in the 18th century. I mean, that's a given. But to try to look at that time, think, okay, what was the norm then? And what can I extract from this speech or this letter? How can it inform me today? And I think that that's really, it seems that to be the subtext of what Mr. West is driving at. And that's what I've gotten. And I think it's a very important point.
Can I add to that? I think the professor's absolutely right. I think there's a great risk that in the 21st century, we try to view historical figures from our perspective and our context, and we do a disservice to ourselves when we do that, because we know, for example, we might read the address here from Washington, his speech that he wrote out, and we might find the words to be, too complicated to get what he's saying, or we might find it to be outdated. But if we focus on all of his imperfections, we would wrongly dismiss what he's doing here, which is giving us wisdom. As someone who founded this nation, he understood what we would be facing in 100, 200, 300 years. He really did. And he understood the nature of republics because he watched, he'd studied history and saw every republic that had ever existed. And he understood what makes them fall. I think I go back to that Washington Square monument and the idea that he said, let us raise a standard to which the wise and honest can repair. And think about that. What he's saying is, I am laying cornerstones for a great superstructure of state that will proclaim liberty throughout the land for the whole world. And we're creating the foundation. Now you, subsequent generation, my posterity, you will create the superstructure that promotes freedom throughout the entire world. And you will perfect it, and you will work on it, and you'll make mistakes, and then you'll fix the mistakes, and you'll make it better. And that's what he was saying. And I think that's one of the great pieces of wisdom we can glean from Washington, is that he isn't saying that it was right, everything he did. In fact, he'd be the first thing he did to expressly say he did a lot of things wrong, but he tried his best in his time. And he conveyed to us the tools and the principles to improve upon it. And I think that's the majesty of the Constitution. It's never complete. It has an amendment process. He always said, be careful if you make amendments. Don't make amendments because you want power. He was very clear about that. And so even today, when we have that discussion, there may be a discussion in the near future about things we should tinker in the Constitution or the Supreme Court or other places. And that's good if it's for the effective administration of our government. It's bad if it's certain people trying to get more power. And Washington understood that.
Yeah, if I could just underscore the importance of contextualism, because obviously the big elephant in the room here is that we are talking about the first president of the republic. Yet at the same time, he was a slave owner. So how do you reconcile those two things? Because he goes to great lengths about, public morality. Here's what I would say, because I think we're in a very unique time period, especially in 2020, when we had national debates about the statute removals and having a public discourse in our nation's history. I applied this rule that I kind of came up on my own. It's called the Winston Churchill rule. It goes like this. Winston Churchill in the Western world is universally well respected. Why? Because he emerged victoriously during World War II. He was able to fight off Nazi Germany. However, if you look at the totality of this record, during his early life, he did not have let's just say, a correct view on ethnic minorities, most notably when he was the Viceroy of India. His views on certain cultures were very critical. And it's almost like, he classified them in a very discriminatory way. So the question is, do you judge Winston Churchill based on the highlights of his life? Or do you look at everything, look at the good, look at the bad, and do you focus on certain things that troubles you? I don't know what the right answer is, and that's the Winston Churchill rule. And you could apply that to just about every important historical figure. And I think what we're getting at here is that, yes, the framers of the constitutions and the forefathers were brilliant in many respects, especially the framework of the Constitution, but they were also very imperfect. And I think what I'm getting at from Mr. Allen's remark before is that it's a three-part process. It's unity, liberty, and happiness. And I think kind of the theme in America's short history is creating that perfect union. However long it takes, however, the road to get there is very challenging, but eventually we will get there. It just takes time. Sometimes it takes a lot of setbacks, but if we reach that state of unity that we think is optimal, then we will get to maximize our liberty. Because I think the vision for America is that we are all entitled to a certain degree of liberty and maintain it. And ultimately, the final product is this notion of happiness. That's kind of how I'm interpreting it. Any comments on that, Professor?
I'm thinking, so it's interesting you bring up Churchill. I was just talking to somebody else about Churchill. Yeah, we could replace him with Washington. We can obviously criticize him. Most of the founders, I won't say all. I mean, you take somebody like James Wilson of Pennsylvania, who, when talking about voting rights, the right of suffrage, he actually said, I'm trying to remember verbatim, that all persons of all ages, sexes, and conditions should have a right to vote. This is in 1787. I mean, that would have been remarkable in 1967 in a lot of places. So to say that all of the founders thought thus is another problem as well, because there were some founders who were ardently anti-slavery. But again, does anti-slavery necessarily mean total equality? Generally speaking, in the 18th century, no, and even in the 19th, it was rare. You have your rare birds. One example that comes to mind is Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania. Was in Congress during the Civil War, one of the radical Republicans, who would be an example, but he was an oddity for his time. So again, context of the day, he was an oddball who you wouldn't trust. Not somebody who was taking those baby steps to allow the people at large to digest the change. Not everybody's an incrementalist, and I think that, Washington was. I mean, we would probably say he was a moderate Republican or a blue dog Democrat. But to even put a label on him in that way is, probably unfair.
How about the Whig Party, as in George Washington Whig Party?
Yeah, and I think generally speaking, he was, but I don't think he didn't want to tie himself down to being a member of a party, because he saw the danger in it, and he saw what it led to, and he saw what was happening in his own cabinet. I mean, he witnessed this infighting between Jefferson and Hamilton, and eventually Jefferson leaving the cabinet because of it, and this sort of wicked tension between Jefferson and Adams. I mean, he saw it, and that was really behind a lot of the words that we read, because these are things he witnessed. First, what had happened and was happening in Europe. Second, what was happening in his own cabinet.
If I could make a devil's advocate argument. So let's say somebody in the mold of Chief Justice John Roberts, who was in the majority opinion of Citizens United. He would say, look, there's nothing wrong with political parties. These are perfectly legitimate phenomena. We have free speech, we have freedom of association, and I'm going to make a ruling on the Citizens United case saying that, look, campaign expenditures are tantamount to free speech. So sometimes you do need these organizations that we're calling political parties so they could coalesce, organize, and have a unifying message and let the best ideas and organizations prevail. What's wrong with that?
Are you asking me or Mr. Allen?
Either.
Okay.
Go ahead, Professor.
You want me to go first? Okay, I'll go first. What's wrong with that? I guess depends on whom you're asking. If we were asking George Washington, what's wrong with that? Not me, but if you're asking George Washington, is that there's a premise which Chief Justice Roberts is working off of, namely that there are political parties which are acceptable and are not causing problems. And if you accept that premise, then okay. Why not? What's the problem with having political parties? This is good. The best ideas, the cream of, as far as ideas, the cream will rise. But I think that history over the past 150 to even 200 years kind of tells us a different story, doesn't it, about political parties? Again, human nature, we're sort of tribal by nature, as it were. We're going to want to, most people are going to want to pick a side. Moderates get bashed right, left, and center. Libertarians and Greens are seen as weirdos and are excluded from discourse because, well, let's just have this bifurcation because it's sort of like MMA fighting. It's awful, quite frankly. So that would be, in layman's terms, where I think George Washington would be with this. And I might concur, at least in part.
Yeah, I'd add to that. I think the idea expressed in the First Amendment that let all ideas be promulgated and let the truest ideas rise to the top. In fact, that's the best system, is to put everything under the crucible of a fire of debate, and the best ideas will win out. The problem is again, going back to this idea of party or faction. It's one thing to express your idea, and Washington would be the first to say it's entirely another thing to allow your fanaticism to one particular party or group get so extreme that it's deleterious to the entire system. And in fact, I just found in Washington's farewell address where he said this about, again, the idea that there can be a usefulness to unfettered discussion and unfettered party system where it's almost a checks and balances where one party will check the party in power. But then he said this about danger of party generally. He called it a fire not to be quenched. It demands a uniform vigilance to prevent its bursting into a flame, lest instead of warming, it should consume. And I think that's the idea that you can have parties perhaps and have different opinions, and even and the idea that you want everyone to express their opinion and put as much energy and resources into an opinion as they can, but be careful, because once you start going down the road of the word I think of as contention, once you start going down the road where everyone's fanatic to one side or the other, it becomes, as Washington said, a fire that won't give warmth, but it will consume. And that's what we have to be careful against.
But I believe this goes back to Professor Brooks's kind of, very cynical view of human nature, which is ultimately we are corruptible. Ultimately, if we are left to our devices, we want to, have power, have as much as possible, maximize it, and retain that power. So, I think Washington had the foresight to at least predict that happening. But at the same time, if you don't let people coalesce and assemble, then it seems like it's not so much of a free society. So maybe Washington was trying to put some, limits or kind of put some brakes on the society kind of having a race to the bottom. Because, as a student of history, I'm sure he saw other civilizations, the free society, like, Greece and European empires, where eventually it fell. Why? Because of corruption, greed, instability in society due to factionalism. It seems like the term faction or factionalism is mentioned quite a bit in the address. But I do have one more question, and then we're going to open it up to our audience. So if you have questions, this would be a time to raise your hand. Seems like I was a bit surprised when I came across this passage. It alludes to some kind of like a national educational system or program. It says, quote, this is like halfway in the address. It says, in proportion as the structure of a government gives force to public opinion, it is essential that public opinion should be enlightened. Now, I had to read that twice. And when I read that, it almost seems like he's alluding to, we need some sort of a national institution of higher learning. Don't you think?
Yes. Am I?
Yes.
Oh, I thought I was muted. Okay, sorry. Yes, yeah, absolutely. There was the first colleges in the United States ultimately started off as religious institutions. Congregationalists at Yale, Reformed Church at Rutgers, Presbyterians at Princeton, etc. Episcopalians at William and Mary. So the early universities are very much tied to the training of religious leadership, the clergy in particular, and their lay people. So I think moving away from that, or evolving from that in a more secular form, more inclusive manner that we might, parlance we might use today, It's difficult to say whether or not George Washington would have envisaged that, but having universities or any sort of schools of higher learning readily and widely available. This is something certainly Thomas Jefferson was a huge proponent of, the educated yeoman farmer kind of idea. Plains just reading at every chance that he had. That is something that this ideal of the sort of quintessential American man, I would say absolutely yes to your question.
Yeah, Thomas, I'll add to that part you read. Washington said, promote then as an object of primary importance institutions for the general diffusion of knowledge. And I think Washington himself recognized he was a product of that. One of the things most people know about Washington is that he was very aware of his lack of education. And it made him, frankly, anxious in the company of educated people because he knew he didn't measure up. And he understood that in our system of government, it's imperative that every citizen be as educated and as enlightened as possible, because we are the ultimate check and balance of power. And so, that's one of the reasons I think we're here tonight, is because people across the country need to be engaged in education and how governance works, because ultimately you're the bosses. We're all the bosses. If we don't have the wisdom to make sure we elect bright people who represent us and are like us and have the best interest of the nation at heart, we do that to our peril. And so we have an obligation to understand what makes good government, to understand these words of Washington, to understand what he thought was wisdom, and then maybe look and see which of our leaders reflect that and understand that. I know, going back to your previous issue about, I just know generally in politics, I'm always, as a parent, I have my first grandson, and I look at my parents and my children in a very significant way. I pluck the very best that they have and keep it and treasure it. And so, for example, if my parents did something I thought wasn't great, I try to learn from that and maybe be a better parent in some small way myself. If I have a child and my child's learning to walk and falls down, I quickly pick that child up and tell him what a great job he did, as opposed to saying, well, you're such a silly child, you can't walk. And I don't know why we don't do that among our leaders, among our peers. Why does one party have to always belittle the other party? What's the motivation for that? Why wouldn't we, hope for the best, whoever our leader is, whether it's the leader we have this moment, or the leader we'll have next year? Why wouldn't we always significantly hope for and laud the positive things? We do that to our own family. We do that to our own children. Why don't we do it to our representatives? We should. In fact, I note that Washington himself, when in the end of his farewell, he was expressing gratitude to everyone. And one of the things he was expressed gratitude about was the support of the people. He felt and understood that he had people who he wanted the best for him and wanted him to be successful. And he made a point to acknowledge that. I think that's interesting, that we don't think as citizens of a free nation, we don't think about the benefits of being positive to those who we've put in power, and to let them be, frankly, respected if they earn it, and to point out the good things they do. We call them out on the bad things they do, but there's no reason for us to tear everybody down just because they're in power and we're not, regardless of political party. I believe that. I used to be a law clerk, so I tend to be very apolitical. And I recognize that both sides in our current baneful party system tear down the other side, and they think that's how they win. And it just does a disservice to our nation. Washington would have hated that.
What about this notion of individualism? Again, America has this very unique brand of rugged individualism. So we tend to, in our individual capacity, question everything. Don't take anything for granted. And I think that tends to then kind of end up in not just trusting certain institutions, and kind of trying to do everything independently, isn't it almost inevitable that because of this notion of individualism that we've adopted over the years, that we have become accustomed to not trusting institutions? Perfect example right now is we're in the middle of a pandemic as we sit here today. And if you ask Americans, they don't trust government agencies. So isn't this something very unique in American psyche, don't you think?
I would start off by saying I don't think that it's unique. And I think it's less common in a number of other places. I find it interesting that the countries that have the exception of Britain's an outlier, but in the continent of Europe, or if we even look to Asia, places like South Korea, for example, the adherence, sort of trust that people have in government is exceptional when juxtaposed to what we see here in the United States. Now, so you have to ask yourself why, which I think is really what we're driving at in your question here. Why? Why is that? I think it's a multifaceted answer, and it's something I'll take a stab at it, what I think. And I think that people are cynical about government because government has hyperbolically promised a lot of things that it couldn't deliver on and knew it. If I have to summarize it in, a sentence or so. And I think that's more the case here than perhaps in other places in the world. I think being direct and honest, saying who you are as a nation. I never forget when I was in Germany, it was Christmas of 2010, about 10 years ago. And Angela Merkel getting up, doing a televised address at Christmas time and saying, "We are a Christian nation." Can you imagine an American president saying, "We are a Christian nation"? What would happen to that president?
Happens all the time.
And nothing happened to him. So I just find that, and I'm not saying that this is not trying to just compare America and Germany. What I'm saying is having a true sense of yourself, or at least what brings people together, can allow for a far less jaded and cynical outlook on government. We don't even know who we are as a nation. And I think it's part of the American experiment, which makes that so difficult to define. And this brings me back also to one of my earlier comments about focusing so much on difference and not on commonalities. Let's just say that religion is not that commonality. Spirituality, maybe it's education, maybe it's the flag, whatever it is. We as a nation need to decide what that is and focus on that. And then move on to the things that are different, that make us such a unique place, that make us special.
Yeah, I wanted to mention, I go back to two of our greatest presidents, Washington and Lincoln, were basically self-educated men. They found within themselves the desire to elevate who they were by conscious endeavor. And I think they tried to pass that on to everyone they met. And it's how they treated everyone. They viewed every single person as a co-equal. I think deep down they did. And someone who was worthy of respect, and someone who could become one of our greatest citizens by the work that they do on their own. And, Washington read and Lincoln read, they emulated the good virtues and characteristics they saw in others. And I think they themselves became an example of what our republic and its citizens need to do. Our system will work if we are trying to be better all the time, both in what the Constitution created, the government, how we administer it, how we treat each other. It's a reflection on our society that we have such a factional system right now. And we're seeing the baneful effects of party right now. And it's to our discredit, perhaps, that we don't reflect the virtues of some of our greatest leaders today. And I think, and I hope there's still a place in America for those leaders who emulate that and who are trying to be the natural next step of what Washington and Lincoln hoped for. We've had a few of them in the last 150 years, but not as many as we should. And I hope through millions of Americans doing things like you're doing right here tonight, Thomas, with a small group, that we try to be better, that we try to find those leaders that are like Washington and Lincoln, that understand what they were telling us and teaching us, that study to know what they were telling us and teaching us, and we seek out those people to be our future representatives.
Okay, thank you. Let's go to some questions. If you do have questions to our panelists, please raise your hand digitally. The first question will come from Liz. Liz, go ahead. Liz, are you there?
Oh, hello, sorry. Do you hear me?
Yep.
I hear you, Liz.
Hello.
Hello. I did post the question in the chat, so I guess I'll just read it. I hope it's clear. So I don't understand how the uneducated masses, at least according to Hamilton and Jefferson, could possibly elect worthy representatives, since being landowners did not necessarily mean that they were educated and qualified enough to choose proper representatives. So, after 1787, when you had that gap, it seems a little short-sighted to me that they assumed that the system would work, even though there's really no guarantee that people would actually select the best person, most qualified person. So how did they, it's just short-sighted. Did they really think about that? How to get around that, or did they just assume that being a landowner would kind of give you that kind of wisdom?
There's a few parts to this answer. The first is that Scottish Enlightenment philosophy, which was infused in thinking, in the ways of thinking in America, to summarize it, ultimately maintained that the average person or people collectively could decide what was best for them. That was ultimately the teachings of people like Thomas Reed and Francis Hutcheson. So as a group, these are the kinds of people who would influence John Witherspoon or even, we can take Madison, who attended Princeton, which was Scottish Presbyterian, or William Small being the primary tutor and teacher of William and Mary, and influencing people like Jefferson. So I think that this manner of thinking and this trust in the common people to eventually come to their senses and decide what was best for them was part of it. To guarantee, I don't think that there are any guarantees on that. But the last part of my answer would speak to the issue of property ownership. And the assumption is that if somebody can have land and maintain it, that he or she, I'm just sort of summarizing the thinking, that he or she would be a leader in society and would thus be able to participate in political discourse. That's basically, the best I can answer that question. There's a lot to that. That's an excellent question.
Yeah, I'd add, I think, Liz, it's very possible that our founders at best had hope that this system would work. because I find it interesting. We still have it today. Technically, we don't elect our president. We have electors elect our president. And I think one thing all the constitutional founders would have agreed upon is that the people generally shouldn't, as a collective group, at least as a pure democracy sense, elect the president. They would have all disagreed that that should happen because they understood that, wait a second, you let the masses elect the president, you're going to have bad presidents. You're going to have people that just kind of pander to the common masses, maybe, whatever it takes to get elected. And they didn't think that would be a good thing. They wanted to have a wise and kind of the most revered person to be president. And, we've tinkered with the system over the last 200 years and 233 years. And, what we have now works pretty well because we have diffused education a lot better than our forefathers and foremothers, but it definitely requires education and enlightenment and people trying to know really who's our best person here. I know I live in Las Vegas, and in Las Vegas, we elect our state judges. And in every state across the country, there's always a debate if that's the best way to do it. Because inevitably what happens is you get someone elected that often is clearly not the most qualified. In fact, may not even be qualified at all. And yet, the masses, the people, voted them in. And it might be because they had a cool name, or it might be something as silly as their gender, or as silly as a commercial that kind of said, I'm going to do this. And everybody said, yeah, I want that as a judge, without really examining their qualifications. And I say that because we can do better perhaps in some of our system, but we certainly collectively now appreciate that all men and women above at least a minimal age have and should be able to educate themselves and pick a representative. And so we now defer that to the people, in part because I think we now trust each other better, and that we have a system in place that for the most part requires us all to be informed. And I think our system expects that. I know Washington hoped for it. He wanted the diffusion of knowledge for a reason, because he understood that's what will make a republic work or fail. Thank
you very much. I hope for that too.
Yeah, just a follow up to that question, and then if anyone else has a question, please raise your hand. Aren't there dangers to nationalizing education? I mean, there are, especially those who are proponents of the 10th Amendment will say, well, education should be left to the states. So once you nationalize it in the interest of having an enlightened public, well, then we're going to have discussions like, do we teach evolutions in schools? How much do we separate, from the church and state? Those types of things. So aren't there some dangers to having a national effort? Anyone?
I'll say a word about federalism, going back to the principle on the Constitution. A republic works best, and this isn't just my opinion, I think it's what our founders believed, is a system that governs locally, or to the great extent, the important things are being decided almost individually, and then within a family, and then within a community, and then within a county or a city, and then a state, and then the national government. And I think that is true for almost everything except the big things that are set forth in the preamble of the Constitution, why we have big government. And that's another topic for another day. But if you want to know what our government does, the Constitution is real clear in the preamble. Here's the things that our government exists by the people to do. And so when it comes to education, our founders wanted education diffused throughout the citizenry. They wanted everyone to be educated, but they didn't want to dictate, I don't think, how that should happen. They would have hoped, I think it's true, that they would have expected, dads and moms to teach their children, and then teachers to teach their communities, and then, other leaders to teach each other locally. Religion played a big part. Universities, as Professor noted, is kind of religion and universities originally were kind of the same thing. And I think the system they envisioned was one that promotes education universally, from the local family, even a person reading their own book, all the way up to a national, maybe university system. And the idea was that everybody would promote education at every level.
Okay, Professor, you want to add anything to that? No, okay.
No, I'm good.
Okay, let's go to, we have time for about 2 more questions. So let's go with Okay, Ellen, are you there? Okay.
Yes,
We're waiting
I'm
for
here.
Ellen.
I didn't hear
Okay.
you. If you were calling me, I didn't hear you. Okay.
Go ahead.
All right. I just had a question. If I understood you both correctly, Washington and the founders, they saw religion as a unifying force for the country. And thinking about where we are today, what do you think Washington would say? And I'm referring to things like in the last week, we just had a decision by the Supreme Court that Governor Cuomo's COVID restrictions on religious institutions were unconstitutional, and the governor did not take kindly to that decision. We've had Little Sisters of the Poor bring a lawsuit against the government for trying to force it to provide birth control in its insurance policy. We had a baker, also a lawsuit being forced to make cakes against his religious beliefs. What do you think the Washington's perspective on this would be if religion was supposed to be a unifying force for the country?
Professor, go ahead.
Okay, all right. In the 18th century context, what was unifying, and then we get into the nature of inclusiveness. Who was meant when one spoke of person, man, citizen? I know in my own research on John S. Rock, you're talking about a man who was a teacher, dentist, physician, attorney, first African-American permitted to argue before the Supreme Court, and was not considered a citizen by people like Roger B. Taney. Oof. I really don't know what Washington would say today. Actually, I think he'd be shaking his head a lot because, I mean, the 21st century is so different from the 18th century, even the 19th or even 20th century for that matter. So it would be, I think, an exercise in anachronism to say what Washington would say today. Can we extrapolate from some of Washington's ideals and words, things that might apply today with respect to religion being a unifying factor? Maybe not religion in the organized sense. You have to also remember the anti-Catholic sentiment of the 18th century, talking about context. The anti-papist movement, as it were. They were tarred and feathered. They were, in rare cases, even hanged. Certainly was the case when we move forward about 150 years in Louisiana. But what would Washington... I think that he would, the teachings of Washington that would really fit here would probably be the idea that trying to work together and unify, not behind a band or party, a faction, but to have that debate honestly, openly, disagree agreeably. I think that would be the lesson I would take that could be applied today. And I don't know how Mr. West feels about that, or Mr. Allen, sorry. how Mr. Allen feels about that.
Well, I tend to agree with Professor, but I'll say this. I think this is partial my opinion, but partially from reading a lot of what Washington in particular said and felt. When I say religion, maybe I ought to be more clear. I want to say having faith or people of faith. I think the original founders in their generation, they were very suspect of organized churches because the only handful that they knew of had done some pretty awful things. And so and that was a reason a lot of them didn't necessarily associate closely with any particular church, but they profoundly believed in an almighty, they used the word providence a lot, the idea that there is the omniscient being that is mindful of the affairs of mankind and humankind. And I say that they recognized the importance of having that belief system, a faith system, whether you're Jewish or Muslim or Christian or any other religion. I think they recognize that the value of a republic to have people of faith, because that does unify people. It makes them profoundly interested in liberty. And they have this idea of an accountability to a God that causes them to act in a way that is very good for governance and very effective for having a free people. And it's so important that Washington himself, again, in his address, he made a point to say that we need to have religion so that we have morality. He wasn't saying we need to have the Church of England or we need to have a particular church. He was just saying we need to have people of faith who, through their particular religion, whatever it may be, come to respect morality and understand it and act in a way that makes for a good system of government. As to one last part of your question, what would you think of today? I think the founders would have, because they were there when we did the First Amendment, I think they would have been deeply concerned that a state or a government would ever tell someone you can't gather or practice your religion. I do think they would acknowledge there are circumstances where there's such an emergency or a crisis where there might be a reason where the governor would say, for example, you shouldn't gather. But I think they would expect far more deference than a lot of governors may have given religion, as opposed to, like, I'm out here in Nevada, we have a case like your New York case, where casinos were given essentially preferential treatment with respect to gathering rules than religious organizations. And one thing our First Amendment teaches is you cannot give disparate treatment to religious organizations and non-religious organizations unless you have a compelling reason to do so, and your reason is narrowly tailored to fulfill that important purpose. And that hasn't been done, frankly, because most governors don't understand the Constitution or the First Amendment really well. If they did, I think they would have been a little more careful in how they kind of promulgated a lot of those rules. Because ultimately, the Supreme Court, which we just saw in your New York case, is going to be very clear about what the Constitution says. And I think that's what Washington would have believed in. He would have been very weary of would-be omnipotent people in government that dictate what religious people can and can't do when it comes to the basis of religion, which is, gathering together for whatever their purpose is.
If I could just underscore that point, and then we'll go Andrew next, who has his hand up. I think the unifying source will be the free exercise clause of the First Amendment. You got to keep in mind, during the late 1700s, America was already a pretty multicultural society. We had the Dutch in New York, we had Germantown, Pennsylvania, mostly Germans. And the most prominent exemplar is, look at Washington's letter to the Hebrew congregation to Newport, Rhode Island. He said in the US or in America, you have the freedom to exercise any religion or no religion at all without any threat of persecution. So I think that would be kind of the pillar of the Washingtonian view of what would unite us, is that by having this freedom, whether if you believe or not believe, that freedom, believe it or not, actually unites us, because we get to respect others who may or may not profess certain beliefs. So I think that would be the Washingtonian answer. Okay, let's go to a final question from Andrew. Go ahead.
Hey, how's it going? I guess this will be for Mr. Allen in terms of the aspect of religion and virtue. So I'm guessing in terms of now, do you still see religion playing a very important role of enlisting people with virtues from religious institutions nowadays? Because it is seeming to be a trend in the USA, especially with evangelicals, how a dangerous role religion can play in terms of taking away the enlightenment values Washington supposedly preached, in terms of taking away rights of women's rights to choose an abortion, and then discrimination against homosexuals and all that stuff. So in terms of myself, I'm not religious at all, but I do have a sense of virtue in terms of myself. But I think it mostly comes personally with me, with the people I interact, and how those people treat others, in which I would like to bestow myself those virtues. But usually those people are not religious themselves. So what's your question in terms of how the importance of, if religion has to play more of a role in enlisting people's virtues?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Andrew. I guess I'll go back to the idea of when the word religion was used by Washington in his address, what he meant by that. And I do believe what he meant by that was the ability of a person, especially in America, to have absolute liberty to believe in a higher power and to exercise faith. And whatever your particular church or religion may be, that our citizens be people who were reflective and sober and believe deep down in the very essence of who they are, that one day they will be accountable to a God. And I think that's the idea that was clearly in the mind of our founding generation. And they weren't so particular about what church you go to. And I know today you're absolutely right. Today, the Pew Research done clearly shows that with each succeeding generation, we tend to be less and less affiliated with any organized religion. And I'd say that what we really ought to be is passionate pursuers of truth. And so if that leads you to a Hindu temple or a synagogue or a Southern Baptist church, God bless you. The point is, pursue truth and seek all the wisdom and knowledge you can. And I think our founders believed, and they know they did because they wrote about it. For them, the pursuit of truth never ended. They used it to form a good government. And then, look at like Hamilton's life or Washington's life or Lincoln's life. They recognize that in times of true self crises, there's a higher power that helps them. And they recognize the benefit of tapping into that and knowing what it is. And so I'd say that today, it's almost not as important what church or religion you go to, as long as you are pursuing truth and have, in my personal opinion, a sense of that there is more, that we're not alone, that there is purpose in what we do, and that liberty is the essence of our being, that essentially, as the Declaration says, God created us in a way where we are inherently free. And that is a thing that came from a God. And that's who we are. If you're Christian or even Muslim, you understand the idea of being the offspring, essentially, of deity, the idea that you're a son or a daughter of a God. That's a profound idea that I think the founders embraced, because they understood if you have a glimpse of who you are, which means you practice faith and you try to pursue truth, you're going to be an outstanding citizen in a republic. And I think that's what's important and can, in some extent, be lost today. I think we do have a danger today of, in the process of discounting organized religion, we throw faith and the religion word, that, as Washington used it, out the window. And we have to be careful of that. We don't need to be afraid of the word religion in our public discourse. Let's be pursuers of truth and let people find their God however and wherever they will, but let them seek and let them have that passion and that freedom to have that passion. And that makes for good government.
Okay, so we're almost out of time. So any final remarks before we sign off? I know, Professor Brooke, when you first started out, you were saying about how in the last several days after the election, you've had some, unfriendly moments, some awkward moments of those around you. So again, you touched on this theme of unity, and here we are having spent 2 hours of George Washington. So what are some of the things that we could take away from what we talked about in the name of unity?
Well, I think one of the themes and that was driven home about religion writ large really could piggyback into another session on the role of religion in 21st century America, and what that means, or maybe the role of spirituality. If we don't have religion, what is there? Religion is what Washington had, but again, looking at things in the context of our time. I have my faith, but I also acknowledge that my faith isn't necessarily that of others. So I think that's one of the takeaways. The other is, one thing that I try to drive home is this issue of trying to avoid being anachronistic. That is one of the most difficult things when we talk about a topic like this, that we kind of start thinking about, looking at things through our lens today, right? And I think that the other bit, which is a large discussion, and that is as large as the issue of religion really, is political parties. Should we have them? Should we not? And if we don't have them, what are they replaced with? Human nature is what it is. People are going to want to associate. I guess one would say it's a penumbra in the Constitution, the freedom of association. But yeah, again, that's a separate topic, perhaps for another time.
Okay,
We just
and
add one more
Alan-
thing.
Sure, please.
What Professor said is so right. There's a natural tendency to break down into tribalism. That's been the history of the world. And the Constitution, I think one of its essential principles in what Washington taught us is that there's far more that unifies us than divides us. And if we, whether it be faith or our love of liberty, these are the things that make us America. And we have to fight against that natural tendency to break down into factions. And Washington, almost above all, was trying to convey that in his last words to us, is to have a republic and to honor the Constitution so that you don't break down into factions and you have unity, which leads to happiness.
If I could go back to Mr. Allen's introductory remark, I think you said something to the effect of our Constitution is at stake. Now, let's say if there is a peaceful transition of power on January 21st, then doesn't that show that, well, our institutions were able to withstand any fragility that we had? So our institutions are still strong. Whatever, I guess, apparent discord or instability that we see is just amplified by social media and other, public conversations. Ultimately, our institutions are still inherently solid. Wouldn't you say that would be a proper assessment of our institutions? Or do you think there's something even more ominous? This is just a telltale sign of further decay that's to come.
I think, if I may say something, Mr. Allen, one thing that kind of struck me is the challenge of the election results, in particular in the state of Pennsylvania, and the fact that it was a Trump appointee who wrote the opinion, and somehow this judge is no longer qualified to do his job. And I think that one could construe that as a form of tribalism. I'm not going to get mired in the weeds of that issue. Again, that's another 2-hour conversation, but I think there's something to be said about that. You know, the assumption, in particular with the third branch being seen as being as political as the first and second branches of our government. And that's another misconception, common misunderstanding. And we see that time and time again. I always like looking at Merrick Garland and the voting records of Merrick Garland and Brett Kavanaugh when they were on the same in the circuit court together, that they agreed 94% of the time. So is it your political party? Is that really what's driving you? Really, I think perhaps the judiciary is the last frontier of some semblance of normalcy. But anyway.
Yeah, I completely agree with the professor. Our Constitution many times has saved us despite ourselves. That was the great wisdom of it. The independence of a judiciary is you could spend a week or a month, a year studying that alone. My organization that I lead, one of the preeminent things that we do is fight and maintain the absolute independence and strength of a federal judiciary, because that third branch, in a sense, is the one standing right now that is really most functional, to be honest with you. And it's certainly a powerful thing that an independent-minded judge appointed by, in this case, Trump himself, can do what the law requires, which is apply the law to the facts. And despite party, the result is X. And, you know, we can fight and kick against that as much as we want. That's what we hope our judges do. That's what judges must do. And the fact that we have a judiciary that does that is one of the reasons we're the greatest country in the world. And I say that meaningfully. I think objectively, the Constitution of the United States catapulted our nation to a position that proclaims freedom to the world. And over the last 233 years, there's no question, it's been the most remarkable republic in the history of the world. And it's been the beacon that's given freedom to multiple nations. And to this day, despite ourselves, we have a system of government that will be just fine on January 20th. By definition, the presidential term expires and somebody else has to become president, and there's a system in place to make sure that happens. So we're going to be just fine as far as the next president goes. And it's our job to keep the system working the way it's intended to work. So I have hope. I mean, I really believe that. I say that the Constitution is in a moment of peril. I believe that. We really need a generation to understand it and to implement it wisely and justly and virtuously, as Washington said. We need that more than ever. But it's such a remarkable system of government that it's going to carry us through for another many generations. Because people like you, because people like are on this call are zealous about making sure that it stays that way.
And this goes back to Mr. Allen's publication. It's Remembering Our Oath and Covenant of Citizenship. So I think on that hopeful and virtuous note, that would be a good place to leave it. Thank you once again, Professor Brooks, Mr. Allen. The opinions and ideas exchanged were very enlightening, if I could borrow a Washingtonian phrase. And what we talked about tonight are my twin passions, history and constitutional law. So we would love to have you come back again in the future. There's so many other topics. I know this conversation could have went on for additional hours talking about different aspects of it, but I think this is a good place to put it. Thank you once again for your time. Hopefully all of you found this discussion to be enlightening, and be well. Take care.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone. Thank you, Professor Thomas.
Thank you. Nice